Hey, I'm Kim Kelly, a labor reporter and author based in Philadelphia who has had a variety of experiences covering and experiencing the growth of the far right in America. And I'm here with Christopher Mathias, who is a reporter on the far right and also the author of this fantastic new book we're going to be discussing tonight, To Catch a Fascist: The Fight to Expose the Radical Right, on sale February 3rd. Now that did I say your last name right?
It's Matthias, actually.
Matthias,
Yeah, Matthias,
man,
yeah.
the one
Yeah,
question I should have known. It's so funny because like we've known each other for so long and I've seen your name written for so long.
I know. Yeah,
But
well,
when
no,
we
it's all good. I mean, I think I was actually trying to think back to when you and I first met, and the first time I remember communicating with you was after I covered that Nazi rally in Michigan, where a bunch of Nazis got punched, and I wrote a story about
Mhm.
it. And you messaged me just saying that it was a good article and it meant a lot. So this is a nice full circle moment.
It really is. And as we'll get into during the conversation, there's a lot of intersections and full circle moments for I feel like anybody who's really been paying close attention to the far right for the past decade.
Yeah,
There's a lot in this book that'll bring back some terrible memories
yeah.
and ring a lot of bells. But before we dive in, I want to get a little sense of your background, Chris Matthias. Where are you from? What kind of family did you grow up in? What kind of like sort of political primordial soup did you come out of as you became an adult and got interested in journalism?
Oh man, fantastic question. So I'm from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, um, which most people know of. It's a small town in central Pennsylvania, right on the Mason-Dixon line, but of course was the site of the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, where the Union finally turned the tide of the war against the Confederacy, and eventually kind of the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. So growing up, the town's economy largely revolved around people coming to the battlefield to learn about the Civil War. And it was really interesting because even in the site of the Confederate Army's greatest defeat, all over town there are Confederate flags. If you go into the gift shops, there's pro-Confederate T-shirts and what have you. Even in school, a lot of times, I was learning, kind of that the Civil War was over states' rights, not slavery. And by function of like the historical importance of Gettysburg, a lot of times the battlefield would attract extremists. So sometimes you would have the Klan turning up to rally in Gettysburg, and it was kind of a big deal. So I think kind of this like ongoing fight over historical memory has always been a part of who I am. I grew up very comfortably. My dad was a ER doctor. My mom was a middle school teacher. And even though where I grew up was like definitely like Trump country, I think it went like 70% for Trump in the last election. You know, I found like a little progressive community that where I think I kind of picked up my politics. I think they're pretty normal, kind of liberal politics, if you will, until I became a journalist. And I think, something I talk about in the intro of the book is kind of a radicalizing moment for me. And I think for a lot of people was covering the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. And I think it just kind of upended my worldview and kind of opened me up maybe a little bit to more radical approaches to dealing with not only the far right but with our politics in general.
Honestly, I remember like when I was reading the book, the very first mention of Seville, it was like a little jump scare. It was
I
like,
know, right? Yeah.
because, well, our viewers don't know this, but both of us and a lot of people we care about were down there. We're covering or participating on, the counter protester side, obviously. And there are a
Right.
lot of folks who are involved in kind of the anti-fascist world and the broader we don't like Nazis world, for which that was a truly formative kind of world-shaking event. And it almost feels like the rest of the world sort of forgot. This is something the recent murder by ICE of Renee Good, one of the first things that popped into my head, besides the obvious parallels with George Floyd, was this feels like Heather Heyer. The reaction to this pleasant-faced, middle-aged, inoffensive-looking white woman being
Hmm.
murdered in cold blood during this event where there's all these far-right extremists, it just echoed in a way that felt so unsettling to me. And seeing the response, back then when Heather was murdered, Trump called her like a beautiful, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful person. And now obviously we've seen how things have changed. So I guess my sort of question is, does how much did Charlottesville, specifically the events that happened at Charlottesville, how much did they matter to in terms of getting us to this moment we're in right now?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, we often forget the degree to which Trump's first rise to the White House corresponded with this explosion in a new generation of secretive white supremacist groups. Um, it was almost like they were trying to resurrect the Klan's invisible empire for like a digital age, right? So it was like this entire movement that at the time, branded itself or euphemized itself as the alt-right. Yeah. Um, and, they were all uh, hiding behind usernames and avatars and pseudonyms online to spread this really, extreme fascist, white supremacist worldview. And what Charlottesville was for them was a coming out party because Trump had won and they felt like they had memed him into the White House, that their propaganda had helped usher Trump into, the seat of American power. Which, I don't think they're necessarily wrong on that count. I think they did play a part. So I think seeing, 1,000 straight up Nazis converge on Charlottesville was a shock to a lot of people that I think maybe thought that era of like explicit racial violence and animus was behind us. It kind of upended a lot of liberal myths, I think, about how far we've come and that things are always progressing forward. And I think, obviously, infamously, Trump afterwards referred to the Nazis as very fine people. And, you know, that was incredibly shocking and upsetting. Obviously, nowadays it feels like it would be just another headline. Um,
If
but
that.
if that, yeah, yeah. And, it's funny, not funny, but it's when you mentioned the kind of the comparison between Renee Good and Heather Heyer, it is interesting how quickly their names have become the world over and what their names represent. I remember I went to Greece on vacation 2 weeks after Charlottesville in 2017, which has a very big anti-fascist movement in Athens. And Heather Heyer's face was everywhere. It was on flyers, anti-fascist flyers across Athens. And I remember I got my Greek friend to translate the poster on video, and it like went viral. But it like that was part of the beginning for me of realizing that there was this kind of anti-fascist network or Antifa network that like kind of spread the globe. So yeah, I think what we were getting at earlier is like it was so shocking and such a Charlottesville was so shocking and signified where our politics were going to such a degree that I think a lot of people were radicalized to the left and started doing anti-fascist work, which is kind of where my book kicks off.
Yeah. And one of the things that makes your book so good and your work so good and useful and important is that you actually listen to and value the work done by anti-fascists, by this kind of underground network, as you phrase it, which is Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Not an organized group, Christy Nome, good Lord. We'll circle back to that. But
Yeah.
and this is something as someone who was kind of more involved on the I guess activist side. Like I'm still a journalist, but some of
Yeah.
us care more about the objectivity thing than others, right?
Right.
So it was something I thought was so important in the way you approach it. Is like you listened to us and you valued what was being said and done by anti-fascist researchers. Not every journalist approached it that way. And I think you were kind of part of this sort of mini boom of like extremism reporters. Like all
Yeah.
of a sudden, there's this tiny explosion. There's a handful of people whose whole beat was kind of tracking down Nazis and reporting on, well, the work being done by people that were tracking them down in a much more physical way. And I,
Right.
I just wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about what it's like being a reporter for a major news outlet during this moment who was talking to activists, who understood the importance of what they were doing and also understood why they would not want to talk to you or talk to other
Mm.
journalists. If you could just kind of get into some of the thornier aspects of that I think folks maybe on the outside reading this work don't quite understand how hard it is to get an anarchist on record.
Completely. I really appreciate you mentioning that. So yeah, I think, excuse me. Initially, all of the coverage about Antifa in 2017, by the way, it's super interesting. No one in America knew what the fuck Antifa was before 2017. Um, Everyone learned that word. By the end of the year, Webster Dictionary adds the word to its dictionary. Oxford Dictionary shortlists it for word of the year. And the reason it blows up is because of all these viral videos of Nazis getting punched, because Nazis were feeling really emboldened in 2017, not only in Charlottesville, but in Berkeley and Gainesville and Lansing. In all these places, they were holding rallies. And every place they turned up, there was people punching them and chasing them off the streets and directly confronting them. And the coverage of the people doing this was really reductive. It only referred to Antifa and anti-fascists as kind of solely obsessed with violence, which we'll get to is incorrect. But also kind of did this both sides-ing, where this was just extremists on the other end of the political spectrum. They were, hysterical, radical leftists that are just as dangerous as the Nazis they claim to be fighting. A lot of the arguments you would hear swirling around are like Antifa is the real fascist and stuff like that.
I
And
remember.
yeah, yeah. So, but that never, really sat well with me. And I always thought that was a false equivalency. And as I did more reporting and earned the trust of anti-fascist activists, I think that was borne out. When we talk about Antifa, we're talking about, an underground network, a subculture, mostly comprised of anarchists and socialists and communists, who, believe in some very basic tenets, which is that the far right sometimes needs to be confronted in the streets, sometimes violently, that the far right should be given no platform to speak or organize, and that the state and law enforcement cannot be trusted in this fight. They're not going to depend on the cops to deal with Nazis in their communities. In that way, it's like a grassroots organic response. And Antifa didn't come out of nowhere. It emerged out of pre-existing networks of anarchists, socialists, communists who had chased previous generations of fascists off the streets of America. And the most direct line, I would say, would be to groups like Anti-Racist Action and Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice. Basically, these movements in the 80s and 90s to chase Nazis out of the punk scene. And it started very, very grassroots and small, incidentally, in Minneapolis with a group called the Baldies, which was a multiracial gang of punks of skinheads. And our association today, by the way, with skinheads as being Nazis, is sad because the initial skinheads were very anti-racist, and it was part of this kind of skinhead subculture, reggae punk that came over from the UK. But eventually the Baldies form anti-racist action, which spreads across the country. There's chapters everywhere. They develop like these points of unity that they all organize around, and they're wildly successful. And they manage to fuck up and chase white supremacist groups for about 20 years, until the early aughts when there's kind of the far right isn't as visible anymore and is on a bit of a decline, and so does the work of anti-racist action. I think an interesting thing to think about when we talk about Antifa is that it kind of rises and falls with the fortunes of the far right. So the reason we all knew what Antifa was in 2017 suddenly was because the fortunes of the far right were very good. And because Antifa emerged, almost like a superhero to like combat
Super soldiers.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, and yeah, I think that's some important background.
I was so glad you added that context because it's uh, not even some of the more dismissive ways that we've seen anti-fascism, anti-fascist activists described as like, a bunch of white anarchist kids who just got mad at Trump. It's like, no, 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 there is so much history to this. It goes
Yes,
so
yes.
deep and
And
so
and
complex.
such a cool history, man. Like there are just like libraries that you could fill with like anarchist scenes from the last 3 decades that are just like mesmerizing documents. It's just like
Yes.
these like grassroots punks who are like collecting intelligence about their local Nazis and organizing to confront them and kick them out of their communities. It's amazing.
I mean, my other half is a sharp, so
Oh, right,
I get to
yeah.
hear about it all the time. There's a lot of reggae happens in this house. I gotta just let it happen.
Yeah,
I'm a heavy metal guy. It's fine.
yeah.
Hating Nazis will bring you together across genres. But
Exactly.
I wanted to pick up on something you're kind of talking about there is the fact that it's not anti-fascism, Antifa, it's not a organization. It's not a group. There's no president of Antifa. Kristi Noem did not arrest the founder of Antifa's girlfriend. It is honestly, on its most basic level, it's a bunch of like sweet nerds who are very
Yes.
good at looking at things on the internet and have very
Yes.
strong political principles. And the fact that it is so kind of anarchist coded, shout out to the other homies, but it is very much intrinsic to modern anarchist politics.
Yeah.
And anarchism, it's all about being horizontal. There
Right.
is nobody in charge. That's sort of the whole game. And so I wanted to get into just the way that you document the actual actions of
Yeah.
Antifa in the book, where you really dig into what some people might think of as the more boring or nitty-gritty or nerdy stuff. It's not just punching Nazis. A lot of it is, well, tell us about what actually goes into identifying what are today's Nazi hunters doing? They're not necessarily punching people out at punk shows, but they're very busy.
They're so busy. And also, I'm so glad you mentioned like what an anarchist, enterprise it is, and that it's horizontal and democratic. I think some of the reason that the right and MAGA and Kristi Noem like insist that Antifa has to have a leader and has to have some rich billionaire benefactor is because they can't conceive of a political movement that is organized any other way. But this is how Antifa and anti-fascists and anarchists are organized. So yes, Nazi punching represents a fraction of a percentage of what Antifa does, even if it gets the most media attention. The bulk of Antifa's work, and which is what my book is about, is intelligence gathering. And essentially, what Antifa has done over the last 10 years is, I think it's remarkable. They basically created this like informal intelligence agency across the country, where they had spies in Nazi groups, infiltrating these groups, putting their bodies on the line to collect intelligence, to collect the messages uh, that Nazis were sending to each other in private servers. You know, something you and I have talked about before. The main character of my book is a man in the Northwest who goes undercover into a group called Patriot Front, and he goes on missions, he goes on hikes, he, witnesses vandalism, and all the while he's just collecting intelligence. He's taking photos of license plates. He's in these guys' apartments taking photos of the magnets on their fridge, and collecting all this intelligence to identify people. And then most significantly, he contributes to their private server, being compromised. And all of a sudden, 440 gigabytes of private messages of this Nazi group, Patriot Front, are taken and posted online in a database. And that database lives on a website called Unicorn Riot, which is a very important character in all this, where anybody can go into this database and search through messages. And there's this sprawling network of anti-fascist researchers who, like you said, are really just like sweet, smart nerds with principles, who are really good journalists and really good investigators. And what that means is they go into these messages and pore meticulously over them for hours and hours and hours to pull out little biographical details that they can use to identify these Nazis. And you know, I'm going to use the word dox a lot. Most people associate the word dox with posting like your address or phone number online as a way of inviting harassment. In the anti-fascist sense, when I talk about doxing, I mean the digital equivalent of ripping the white hood off of a Klansman. It means identifying a Nazi that keeps their Nazism a secret from their communities. So you're ripping off that hood and you're showing that this dude who wants to kick all non-white people out of America is a doctor, is a politician, is a pastor, is a professor. And they do this, uh, you know, for a bunch of reasons, but mostly it's to create a social cost for being a fascist. So if once they dox a Nazi doctor, for example, anti-fascists will call that hospital and say, "Hey, listen, you should probably fire this Nazi doctor. I don't think he can be trusted to treat black patients, for example." And that doctor might get fired. And what that does is that creates a cost for joining these fascist groups. It lets everyone know that if you're going to join one of these groups, we're going to find you, we're going to identify you, and we're going to name and shame you. You might lose your job, you might lose your girlfriend, your family might not want to talk to you anymore. So that's a large part of what anti-fascists were doing. And it's remarkable. I made a spreadsheet, a database of doxes over the last 10 years. And I got to 1,000 before I just couldn't do it anymore. It was too tedious. But they doxed thousands of people over the last 10 years. And this research that Antifa was doing, like I said, I believe it's remarkable journalism, was the hidden hand behind thousands of news stories. Journalists were using this research, often not citing the fact that it came from anti-fascists. And for stories about Nazis across the country. So, and in that sense, by the way, we started this conversation talking about Charlottesville. A lot of the groups that were in Charlottesville fell apart in the years after Charlottesville because of anti-fascist work. Not only because of confronting fascists in the street, which they did successfully, but by doing this research, intelligence gathering, and doxing, it totally destabilized all of these groups. For example, Identity Europa, which was kind of this suit and tie fascist group that was basically trying to take over the Republican Party, didn't survive after anti-fascist spy went into the group, again, collected all their messages, and within a couple years, 100 members of Identity Europa had been identified and been doxxed. And eventually the group disbanded. So I think there is a liberal tendency to suggest that Antifa doesn't exist or that it is just a bunch of, like you said, white anarchist kids who are adventurous and want to punch people in the streets. The truth is so much more interesting and so much more remarkable.
I think people that read this book will come away with a very, very different view, hopefully, of the past few
Yes.
years and of all that work that's been put in. And also, I know even just in our conversation, for someone listening in who's a little newer to the concepts, the thought of like they had a spy or they're doing intelligence gathering, they're doing it sounds very sophisticated, almost intimidating. But there's a quote from Molly Conger, a
Yes.
incredibly accomplished researcher. She's taken down more Nazis than anyone's
Yes.
grandpa they post on the internet. But she said, like to paraphrase, like you can do that. Like if you, this is basically the same thing as going through your ex's wedding photos on Instagram. Like you
Yes.
can do this. It is not. It's in a skill. It's a skill that you need to acquire the ability to do this, but it's not that hard. And there's lots of
No.
people that would be happy to help you if you are interested in doing this work. Like I remember there was a moment. Well, it happens sort of all the time whenever Antifa pops up in the news, and you have these sort of well-meaning liberal types being like, "We're all Antifa, like World War
Yeah.
II,
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
this," and it's like,
Yeah.
okay, like that's cute. Like I like the energy, but if you really want to be Antifa, like, why don't you go see what your weird racist nephew's up to online?
Yes, yeah, yes. And what Molly said, like about if you can investigate your ex on Instagram, you can do this type of work is so true. Like I've seen people do that type of work casually, and if they apply that to anti-fascist work, they'd be remarkable. Um, and also I want to touch, you just touched on something that I'm trying to stress in all the interviews I'm doing, which is this liberal idea, for example, that we are all Antifa, World War II, rah rah.
Mhm.
I think it's a really important distinction to make. Yes, Antifa is a shortening of the word anti-fascist. But no, it doesn't apply to the U.S. Army in World War II. The U.S. Army was a segregated army whose black soldiers fought in segregated units and returned to America to live under Jim Crow. The U.S. Army was also a colonialist army, right? This isn't to denigrate. My grandfather fought in World War II. A lot of our grandfathers did. It's not to denigrate what they did. It's just a matter of distinguishing between terms. Antifa refers to a radical militant tradition, and I think a really good way to think about it is in American history in particular, Antifa were the Lincoln Brigade that went to fight in the Spanish Civil War, that were anarchists and socialists and communists that fought alongside black soldiers in integrated units. And, the U.S. Army, for example, was fighting fascists, but was not like Antifa in the way me and you use the term. And I think the way the term should be used.
Honestly, I feel we could talk about this for a million years. I'm keeping an eye on the time, but I'm so glad you mentioned the military.
Sure.
Because one thing that's very clear in the reporting you did for this book and all this anti-fascist research that's been out for years is that there are quite a few members of the military and police and DHS and a lot of there's some pretty high-ranking names that are found in this book in the military-industrial complex. A lot of them have been found to be members of these kinds of groups.
Yeah.
And we've seen, in the kind of earlier era that you're writing about, there were consequences for that. There were people that lost their jobs, lost their ranks, got kicked out. And now I kind of have to wonder, given the state that we're in now, do you think that the work, do you think that this can happen again? Do you think that the people in power now care that there are Nazis everywhere in the rank? I have, I kind of have a thought, and I'm sure it's kind of an obvious answer, but just thinking in the context of the ebb and flow of Antifa work, of when the far right is on the way up, so are we, so is our Antifa. And we're in this moment where the bad guys they haven't won the whole ball game, but they've
Right.
stolen a lot of bases.
Yes.
Like, I have to wonder, like, how much, because the work always matters, but in this moment, in this context, how important is that kind of research and that kind of doxing? What kind of results can we expect, if not the same as before? What has changed? What's the deal now?
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on the animating question of my book, which is, um, like I said before, doxing, unmasking. The whole point of it is that it leverages an existing societal taboo against explicit white supremacy or fascism to ensure consequences, to create a cost. Like I said, if you're a Nazi doctor, you get doxxed, you get fired. The animating question of my book is what happens when that taboo starts to disappear. And, you know, the reason in my book I go into the histories of the first and second clan is to talk about, the efforts to unmask those clans were really successful, and destroyed the clan, both the first and the second clan. But something else interesting was also happening, which is that part of the reason the first clan dissolved, ended, was because they were successful, right? Because they were formed as a group to destroy Reconstruction, to destroy Black people in the South getting rights. And Reconstruction was abandoned eventually. The second clan was also, destroyed in a large part through the work of its opponents. But it also was successful. Part of the reason they disbanded was maybe they weren't needed anymore because in 1924 they, helped pass the immigration law that restricted immigration to just a few
1890
countries.
levels.
Yes, exactly. Um, and that law, by the way, the Johnson-Reed Act, was named after a Klansman. And it's so interesting when you think about it now. That 1924 immigration law was eventually overturned in 1965. But Stephen Miller, our de facto president, he wants to return America to that 1924 immigration law, that Klan law. So, you know, to go back to your question though, like, my book is about the success of anti-fascist doxing and unmasking and spy work and intelligence gathering. But, obviously when you look around, you can't, for example, dox the president. We know who he is. He is, I would argue, a white nationalist, and we know his address. We know what he does. So it's like all out in the open right now. That said, what I find so interesting right now is that a lot of anti-fascist work, and this is something I'm writing about right now, has moved to mobilizing against ICE. Who is wearing masks right now? It is ICE agents. That's who needs to be unmasked. Um, you know, Part of what I talk about in my book is in fascist politics, you wear a mask in hopes of creating a world where you won't need to wear a mask at all. So it horrifies me to think about a world in which the ICE agents that are terrorizing Minneapolis right now will feel comfortable not wearing a mask. So I think anti-fascist work right now has changed a bit. It is not about this new generation of Nazi groups. The Nazi groups are now armed agents of the state. So the stakes are higher, and there needs to be a lot more people doing this kind of grassroots anti-fascist work, which is exactly what's happening in Minneapolis. When you look at what's happening in Minneapolis, it is an organic, grassroots, militant, anti-fascist response to the armed agents of the state that are terrorizing that city. They are following ICE agents on the street. They are documenting where they're going. They are doing noise demos outside their hotels. They're getting hotels to cancel reservations for ICE agents. They are trying to make life hell for these ICE agents so that they get the fuck out of town. And to me, that bears such a strong resemblance to, the anti-fascist tactics that you and I have reported on for the last decade. So I find it really interesting.
Honestly, that was one thing I was going to mention. There's so much. It's almost a joke at this point. Like, oh, where did all the Proud Boys go? We don't hear about them anymore. They all
Yeah.
have badges and guns because
Yes.
it's so easy to join ICE. Like, why bother being in a a sort of naughty paramilitary-esque gang when you can just get paid to do it completely with complete immunity or impunity,
Yes.
both, as people say. So it's yeah, like the new wave of Antifa. Maybe it's not labeled that. I mean, it couldn't
Yeah.
hurt to do so. And it does beg the question, all of a sudden, the Trump administration, they've been freaking out about Antifa again.
Yes.
They
Yes,
gave
they
us
have.
like it's been a good 5 years since, if not more, since they cared. All of a sudden, this is the boogeyman. This is the, what is it, the NSM-7 that Ken Klippenstein's been yelling about, like that
Yeah.
terrifying order that really people should know more about. Like it's so sort of cliche to say, oh, history rhymes, history repeats, but like,
I
man,
know. Yeah.
like, is anyone
Like we're
is
we're
anyone
calling
seeing?
it we're calling anti-fascist terrorists. Like that's yeah. Let's unpack that.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
still so much work to do,
Yeah.
but thankfully, you've given people a really good, almost guidebook into how to actually do it and what can happen when put your scrolling to good purposes.
Yeah.
And since we're getting near the end of the road for this time until you come to Philly and have a beer with me, I
Yes.
do want to ask, and this is something that I hope people watching this are kind of quietly thinking to themselves. If I if I wasn't me, if I was just a person who was kind of recently activated, caring about politics, caring about ICE, like feeling they need to do something, but they're not a punk rocker, they're not an anarchist. They still feel a little like awkward going to the local radical bookshop, but they really do want to help and they have a little free time. How does a person become Antifa?
Yeah. I think there's no way to like join Antifa. I
Yeah, we don't
mean,
have membership cards. Like,
yeah,
there's
yeah,
no
yeah.
sign-ups. Don't give anyone
Yeah,
your email.
I mean, yes, like to be fair, like there are some more formalized groups that like grew out of old anti-racist action formations. But for the most part, it is something you do on your own and you find people along the way. A lot of the people I talked to just started doing little stuff online, and then all of a sudden we're ushered into this network and kept meeting more and more people that were doing this work, that abided by the same principles. So, I think we were just talking about Minneapolis, like that is the kind of organic Antifa organizing in action. And it's organic and also doesn't have to call itself Antifa, obviously you can call it that if you want. And I think it, can be a helpful label. But yeah, I think you will find your fellow travelers once you start doing this work in a, uncompromising, uh, confrontational way. And, I want to also get across. I think a lot of the work that the people in my book did was really brave, and they put themselves at risk. There is also a tremendous mental toll to dwelling in these dark spaces online, and they also, I argued, I think, were kind of Cassandras. They saw that this fascist movement was going to gain power and become bigger and, kind of take over the Republican Party. But for my money, the kind of chattering classes, the pundits, the mainstream news outlets, didn't listen to them and kind of dismissed them as hysterics. So, I would argue that maybe they are worth listening to and paying attention to now.
I have to tell you how gratifying it was to see just that one little line in your book that said Antifa was right.
Yeah.
Because that is extremely real. Like you said, the people that were dismissed as hysterics or overthinking it or just wanting to go out and punch people who disagreed with them, like there was so much disdain and disgust and just negative feeling dumped on so many people that were trying so hard to help. And I hope that this current round of whatever we're going to call it, this new era of anti-racist action
Right.
capitalized or not capitalized. I hope that people are able to read this book and kind of look back and think and realize, like, you know what? Maybe, maybe it has been this bad. And maybe since it's gotten even worse, it's my turn to do something about it.
Exactly. And I think, kind of baked into liberal and centrist uh, dismissiveness of Antifa, snark and curiosity. Um, this idea that Antifa doesn't even really exist, um, is baked into that idea is this idea that things can't possibly be that bad, that like things can't possibly be as bad as they were in the 1930s, 1940s. And I think, a very valuable part of kind of the militant anti-fascist tradition or perspective, the radical perspective and anarchist perspective, is that things can always be that bad. And for a lot of people, contrary to the myth of what we told ourselves about the last century, things have been that bad. You know, we like to think this in the story that we tell ourselves about America that we defeated fascism in World War II. But what is the material difference if you were, for example, a black man swept up in mass incarceration? What is the material difference between that experience and the experience of fascism, the way we imagine it in all our movies and comic books and what have you? And I would argue that there's not much of a difference, and that like so many Americans have been living under some kind of form of fascist politics for the last century. What we are seeing now is an acceleration of that underlying fascist dynamic. It's an attempt to make that social arrangement all that more explicit, all that more racist. So, yeah, again, I think it's just kind of yet another perspective, a radical perspective that I think mainstream pundits, mainstream news outlets need to finally give some time to.
You know, there's only so many journalists left. And there's a lot of folks that were involved in the first round of like the really big first round of anti-fascist research are getting pretty tired. So
Yeah,
it's time to bring in some new blood and to really start thinking about what the part that just regular people can play.
exactly.
It's always been this bad for some people, but we've now that we've gotten to the point where a nice Midwestern white mom got shot in the face. If it took that to get you activated, okay, we're
Yeah,
glad you're here now.
exactly.
Time to get to work.
Yes. I couldn't agree more. And I think the reaction we're seeing in Minneapolis and elsewhere, um, kind of underlines, I think, the anti-fascist ethos that you can't trust the state or law enforcement to come to your to save you. You know, the police in Minneapolis, what are they doing against ICE? What is the Democratic Party doing? There's a reason that people are taking up action themselves. And I think this is probably a good, way to end it is that like there is an abiding, you know, uh, a phrase you hear a lot in anti-fascist organizing, in anarchist spaces, in Black liberation spaces, which is, we protect
We
us.
protect us.
Yeah, and I think that is exactly what we're seeing on the ground right now.
It's beautiful.